It's a minute past 9, and we do have a quorum already. There's still one or two members that needs to link up with us. I don't see them on the system as yet, but it doesn't matter. We are 4 members in the chamber. A warm word of welcome to all of you. We're going to discuss this morning the fundraising amendment bill B29 of 2020, and some amendments will be made to the bill, and that is what we're going to present this week. Various parts of the province. We're now in the city of Cape Town. This afternoon we will be in Saldanha. Tomorrow we will be in Laingsburg, and I think Wednesday morning we will be in Mossel Bay. And then we will head back to Cape Town again to look at all the amendments, all the input we receive from the public, and our counterpart, National Department of Social Development, will be responsible to streamline everything with regard to the bill. Let me make use of the opportunity to ask our members first to introduce themselves. I'm Dan Plater, the chairperson of the Social Development Standing Committee, and the honourable members can do the same.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, officials. Good morning to members of the public. My name is Christopher Fly. I'm a member of this committee.
Good morning, Deirdre Bartman. I'm an alternate. I'm standing in for Member Bosman.
Good morning, Member Kassim. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have 2 members representing the National Council of Provinces. Could they introduce themselves, please? Honourable Advocate, you and your team. You may the white button, please. That's it.
Good morning, Chairperson, once again, and good morning, honorable members. I'm Luyanda Mtrochisa from the Department of Social Development. Thank you.
Good morning, Honorable Chair and honorable members. My name is Gosnati Dladla from National Department of Social Development. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I see some members of the public with us. I don't see any member of the public online. It is very interesting. I said to the lady over there this morning, sometimes this room is packed with people, and then you have certain periods of meetings where there's only 1 or 2 people present, but that's how it goes, and we need to let it go as it is. But may I ask the lady, please introduce yourself.
Good morning, members and visitors. I am visiting from St. Luke's Combined Hospices, and I am the coordinator for the Donor Development Program. Thanks.
Thank you very much. May I ask the gentleman to do the same?
Good morning. Thank you, Chair. Daniel Minnar. I'm from Agri Western Cape, and we represent the majority of this province's commercial farmers.
Thank you for that. And then Honorable Baku Vos just walked in. Baku Vos, can you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. I'm member Baku Vos.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Let me just repeat, the purpose of the meeting is to hold a public hearing. It will be public hearings, not one public hearing, on the Fundraising Amendment Bill B29B, as I have stated before, 2020. Much background information on the legislative process followed on this bill. This is part of the legislative process. We do have the experts representing the National Council of Provinces. They will lead the process. They will fill us in with regard to the clauses in the bill that needs to be amended and that sort of thing, and they will steer us through the necessary processes. The bill was referred to the Standing Committee on Social Development by the Speaker on Friday, 24 February 2023. On Wednesday, 17 May 2023, the committee was briefed by the National Department of Social Development on the bill. So we had that presentation. And in terms of public participation on this, the bill was advertised in the mainstream and community newspapers in 3 official languages to reach stakeholders from different communities. In addition to this, the notice for all the public hearings was emailed to municipalities and NGOs. And then the committee is complying with Section 118 of the Constitution and Standing Rule 72 of the Provincial Parliament Standing Rules, which says the Provincial Parliament must, and this is important, you may enter, sir. Sorry for that. Thank you. And this is important. The Provincial Parliament must facilitate public involvement in the processes of its committees as required by the Constitution. And the committee will formulate its mandate for the province based on the public input received during the public hearings on the bill. And I think that is the constitutional input from my side with regard to the process. The bill and the hearings will follow. On that note, before I hand over to our 2 learned officials, let me just ask another member just walk in. Morning, honourable member. Could you just, for the record, mention your name, please?
Good morning, Chair and everyone. My name is Member Rachel van Vogel.
Honourable member, thank you very much. And I think it is 2 honourable people representing also the public. Could you introduce yourself? Just help the gentleman to press the white button, please.
Good morning. I'm Mr. Jacobs. We're representing the Cape Community Minstrel Board.
Thank you very much. Sir?
Good morning. I'm Anwar Losper from Cape Community Minstrel Board.
Thank you. You're very welcome. Thank you for your presence. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Dankie. On that note, without any further ado, may I ask Honourable Advocate that you lead the process. Thank you.
Good morning, Honorable Chair. Once again, honorable members, colleagues, and honorable members of the community. The purpose for the presentation today has just been explained by the Honorable Chair in relation to the bill, that is the fundraising amendment bill, that we are here to present in the process of soliciting public comments. Just as a way of introduction in terms of this bill, we will remember that in the early 70s, the apartheid government established what we call the Fundraising Act of 1978, that is Act 107, to provide social relief services to the white minority in the country at the time. The monies accumulated in the various funds were dispersed to mainly white communities who were allegedly affected by disasters, acts of terrorism, acts of social violence, and refugees who supported the regime at the time. You will understand, Honorable Chair, that this is almost 46 years ago, so the bill is really needed because the act is quite outdated. So many of the things happened at the time and are not necessarily in line with the current dispensation. So the declaration of disaster was confined to the then South Africa, that is with the exclusion of the homelands, the TVB states, in other words, and the self-governing states that we had. As a result, only few people benefited from the social relief services to the exclusion of the majority in the country. In view of this, following democracy, the Department of Social Development was tasked with a mandate to develop safety nets to cushion the vulnerable communities against the impact of food insecurity and vulnerability due to the life exigencies. To this end, one of the severe impacts to communities is exposure by vulnerable communities to hazards and risks that culminate to disaster due to the lack of disaster risk mitigation and development programs in the environment that communities reside. So it is one of these challenges that we are having currently with the disaster management system with regard to this particular legislation, the disaster risk mitigation measures. Because from time to time, we will know that there will be challenges in relation to fell fires, flooding of the area during the rainy seasons and all of that. But the kind of legislation that we have does not necessarily have the risk mitigation measures so that we are aware in advance as to what we will be doing. So that's why we need to amend this legislation as one of the reasons. So recognizing the need for uniformity of approach, the Disaster Management Act of 2002 was developed, and it called for the development of the National Disaster Management Framework to provide a coherent, transparent, and inclusive policy on disaster risk mitigation appropriate for South Africa. We must take into account, Honorable Chair and Honorable Members, that this piece of legislation is not actually the overarching piece of legislation when it comes to disaster, because there is Disaster Management Act, being administered by COPTA, but this one is just subsidiary to that in terms of the fact that each department is expected to, in terms of the National Disaster Management Framework, to have a role to play. So it is against this background that this particular legislation exists in the department. So the contents of the National Disaster Management Framework are far-reaching and based on the requirements of the Disaster Management Act. And this particular act, that is the Disaster Management Act, gives priority to the application of the principle of cooperative governance for the purpose of disaster risk management and emphasis on the involvement of all stakeholders in strengthening the capabilities of national, provincial, and municipal organs of state to reduce the likelihood and severity of disasters. We must also take into account, Honorable Chair and Honorable Members and members of the community, as I indicated, that This is a very old piece of legislation. In terms of the legislation at the time, there was no picture of the cooperative governance. The nature of the state was not as the three-tier state that we have today. That is your national, provincial, and local government. So this challenge existed at the time, but now there is something that we need to do to align this piece of legislation with the current dispensation. As a result, the legislative gap has been identified in enabling the Department of Social Development to embark on the fundraising drive by approaching both private and public sectors to deal with issues of short-term relief and sustainable development, because all the government departments are now expected to make a contribution towards the disaster risk management, as I indicated earlier. So in that way, the state now is given that power to do the fundraising. You must also take into account that some of the functions in terms of the 1978 legislation have been overtaken by the NPO legislation, that is the NPO Act, because the issue of fundraising by organizations has been taken over by the organizations themselves, with the minor part that is left for the state to act in terms of soliciting funding from members of the community, international donors, and like that, as we shall see as we proceed with our presentation. It is therefore prudent, Honorable Chair and Honorable Members, for the Fundraising Act to be amended with a view to introduce the Disaster Relief and National Social Development Fund. By so doing, would also address the issues of disaster risk mitigation that are part of the requirements as enjoined by the National Disaster Management Act, and also the related prescripts, which is one of those being the National Disaster Management Framework. So accordingly, the proposed amendment, Honorable Chair, will ensure that the Fundraising Act is brought about in order to dissolve the funds that are in existence and come up with a new fund that will, at the end of the day, be the fund that will be responsible for the disasters for the purposes of the Department of Social Development, not for the purposes of the disaster management framework as contemplated in the Disaster Management Act. So basically, the Fundraising Act, as was promulgated in 1978 to provide for control over collections and contributions from members of the public and other sources, it had set up some various funds. So this Fundraising Act at the time came up with some various funds, 5 of them in nature, but our concentration is on 4 of those for the purposes of this particular amendment. It came up with the Disaster Relief Fund, the State President's Fund, the Refugee Relief Fund, the Social Relief Fund. The status of these and the purpose of these funds are as follows. The Disaster Relief Fund is meant to provide assistance to victims and survivors of disaster. The fund is active and provides short-term relief to victims of disaster in 4 communities. So this fund is active, is the fund that social development utilizes from time to time when there is a disaster. We also have the State President's Fund, which is actually meant to provide short-term relief to victims and survivors of acts of terrorism. Since 1994, the fund was activated in 2002 to assist with the burial of the victim of a bomb blast in Soweto. You will take note, honorable members of the community, honorable chair, honorable members of this house, that we do not have much of those instances in the country. Hence, the fund is not active at present. It was only actioned once in 2004, when there was this bomb blast in Soweto. So the two children of the deceased received support until 2010 when they reached the age of majority in terms of that fund, and who later relocated to Lesotho, which was actually the country of their origin. So because there has been no instance of such nature thereafter, that fund is lying there dormant. It was meant to kick in when there are such acts of terrorism at the time the act was developed, that is in 1978. The Refugee Relief Fund, which is actually meant to provide assistance to refugees, it has remained dormant ever since the new dispensation. You will take note that this Refugee Relief Fund is not for refugees in the context of the South Africa that we have today. It is the Refugee Relief Fund in the context of the refugees that we had at the time in 1978, because there were refugees who were in support of the apartheid system of government, who would come in and assist government, and then they would be assisted in terms of this fund at the time. So that is why this fund has also been dormant all along, because we do not have that kind of a scenario today. So it is not for the refugees in the context of today. But the purpose now of trying to consolidate these funds in order to come up with a new fund is to make sure that we bring in all these monies that are lying dormant so that we can use them for issues of disaster during this period that we live in. The Social Relief Fund, which is meant to provide funding to organizations providing assistance to victims of violence. So this fund was last active in 2001 and has remained dormant ever since. So the purpose of, or one of the purposes of this amendment is to ensure that we consolidate all these funds, take all this money, put it in one new fund, which is being established in terms of this amendment, which will be now utilized for the purposes of disasters that we have. Because as it is now, it is not possible to utilize those monies because they are meant for a specific purpose in terms of the reasons why they were set up for. So that is why we have this amendment today. We also have the South African National Defence Force Fund, which is meant to provide short-term relief to members of the South African National Defence Force and their dependents who suffer financial hardship arising from the performance of their duties and which may have rendered them incapable of providing for themselves. This fund is housed at the National Department of Defence. That is, we are not dealing with this fund for the purposes of this amendment. This fund will remain with the Department of Defense for them to deal with it or to utilize it when there is a disaster in the country, as you would see the South African National Defence Force being involved in issues of rescuing people during disaster and all that. So a number of challenges, as you have realized that this piece of legislation is very old and its intention was not designed for the South Africa that we have today. A number of challenges have been experienced in the implementation of this particular fund. The challenges that have been experienced will range from the non-alignment with the current dispensation, because we'll have noticed that this is a 1978 legislation. In 1997, the NPO Act was promulgated and took some part of the functions of this piece of legislation, where the power to solicit funding by NPOs was created in terms of that particular piece of legislation that is taking a little bit of a chunk from this 1978 legislation. In 1999, the PFMA, that is the Public Finance Management Act, was also passed into law. And when that became law, it had an impact on these funds, because you cannot speak of any fund in government outside the context of the PFMA, that is the Public Finance Management Act. So these funds that are lying dormant currently and this other active one, they've got a challenge in the sense that they are not recognized as Schedule 3 public entities as contemplated in the PFMA, of which some of these funds have to be recognized as public entities. When you speak of the appointment of the board members and all that, the establishment of the funds, this must be in line with the PFMA. That is not the scenario. So this is one of the reasons why we need this particular legislation today. That is this amendment to bring things together in line with the current dispensation. As a result of the introduction of the NPO Act in 1997, only two pieces of legislation, so two chapters in this legislation remain. And these are the chapters that we are dealing with today. And some of the funds have become dormant, as I indicated, and presently relief services as contained in the Fundraising Act are fragmented and costly to administer due to lack of consistency in the application and implementation. Because you will notice that as we have 4 different funds, it means we've got 4 different boards, and that is costly on its own to have 4 different boards. While some of these funds are inactive and all that, and we still have to compensate people, and that is a challenge for the state. From the finance perspective. So the institutional arrangements as contained in the Fundraising Act are also not conducive to respond immediately to issues of emergency when the disaster comes. You will notice that from time to time when there is a disaster, be it fire, be it floods, be it whatever nature of disaster that we have in the communities, there is a need for the government to respond. And because of this legislation, of the nature of this legislation, it becomes difficult to respond immediately, whilst the nature of the disaster itself needs a turnaround time of a few minutes or seconds, if we may put it in that way. And there is often a complaint sometimes from the members of the community that, no, why does government take 2 days to respond, or 3 days, or a week to respond, and all that, whilst other organizations would take a minute to be on the scene? Because those organizations, they actually account to themselves. So it's easy for them to take a decision within a twinkling of an eye. Whilst with regard to government, we don't have that piece of legislation because we need to follow a certain protocol in order to utilize public funds. It cannot be that something happens now and something happens in the next hour. There is a need to follow some processes to accumulate some signatures and all that before you can respond. So this legislation, this amendment seeks to ensure that at the end of the day, that does not happen. There is a way of dealing with a 0-minute turnaround time, if I may put it that way, so that when there is a disaster, whoever is responsible can respond immediately. Again, Honorable Chair and Honorable Members, in most cases of the Fundraising Act provisions, there is a duplication of the relief services, because we also have what we call the Social Assistance Act that also speaks to issues of disaster. This legislation was passed in 2004. And in that piece of legislation, there are issues of disaster that we can deal with. So there's a challenge in that regard. And because of the duplication, we need to ensure that we harmonize this piece of legislation with all the pieces of legislation that have got a bearing on it in today's South Africa. So the amounts of money that lie locked in 3 different funds, domain funds make it difficult to address a wide-ranging emergency situations affecting vulnerable communities. So it is in terms of this particular reason why we also need this amendment, so that at the end of the day we are able to respond immediately as government when issues of disaster visit our shores. 4 boards, as I indicated, that these are 4 different funds, and meaning that they've got 4 different boards. 4 boards dealing with issues of relief have been found to be inappropriate and inefficient in emergency situations. Imagine when there are 4 different boards and not understanding who must act first, who must do what, when, it becomes very difficult. But if these 4 boards get to be consolidated into 1 board and the number is reduced in terms of cost and efficiency and effectiveness, then at the end of the day, it becomes easy for government to respond under those circumstances. So while the Disaster Management Act enjoins all government departments or organs of state to develop and implement disaster risk mitigation projects, thus reduce the impact of disaster when it occurs, the Fundraising Act promotes reactive short-term intervention with no provision for sustainable long-term development. So we need to ensure that this legislation caters for that at the end of the day through this amendment that we are requesting you to take note of and provide commentary thereon. Furthermore, Honorable Chair and Honorable Members, the previous committees, that is portfolio committees, the National Treasury, Auditor General, and such other stakeholders have raised a concern with regard to these many boards, many board members, as to the challenges of efficiency, effectiveness, and also austerity measures that we need to take care of as a country, the declining financial position of the state and all that, to say sometimes, I mean, we unnecessarily have so many boards whilst we could have a single board and look at all these things and save on the amounts that we pay to board members and the administrative costs that come with that at the end of the day. So it's one of the reasons why we need to amend this. Just a rough idea, Honorable Chair, honorable members and members of the community, that the amounts that are available at present with regard to these funds are as follows. With regard to the disaster relief fund, which is active, as I indicated, there is about 30 million rands available. You must also take into account when we say 30 million rands in this regard, this is more of a change, because one would argue that 30 million rands may sound too insignificant with regard to the nature of disasters that we have in the country. And because this fund has been active all along, this one, that is the disaster relief fund, it has been utilized whenever there is a disaster. So this is just the balance of the amount of money that is available when we say 30 million rands, not what is budgeted for at present. With regard to the State Praises Fund, there is about 40 million rands, 701,682 rands, and this one is dormant. The one we said it was once used in 2002 when there was a bomb blast in Soweto. The Refugee Relief Fund has got about 640,000 rands, 408 rands. Is the one that we said it was used for the purposes of refugees who were in support of the system at the time, that is pre our constitutional democracy. The Social Relief Fund, which is also dormant, is sitting at 39 million and 8,852 rands. So the total amount of money that is available is 110,390 rands 942,000. So this is the amount of money that will be transferred to a new fund, which is the Disaster Relief National Social Development Fund. So this fund, if this bill becomes law tomorrow, then we'll have a new balance of 110 million, which will then be budgeted for from time to time to add to the existing amount of money. The fundraising amendment bill, as its strategic focus, therefore, aims to amend the provisions of the Fundraising Act by removing the duplication of services inherent in the current relief funds, so that at the end of the day, we are clear as to who has to do what, when, whether it is a national government that must do this, is the provincial government that must do that, is a municipality that must do that, because that becomes a challenge when a disaster comes, as to who must act under the circumstances. And without that clarity, it becomes a challenge. And those who are actually suffering on the ground, they suffer more because they don't know our processes as government. That is our pieces of legislation that are tying up our hands. Not that we do not want to respond, but because we are not sure who must act when. So this, the intention for the amendment also seeks to streamline responses to disaster and allows for risk mitigation and developmental strategies to be deployed. And the fund will therefore deal with a broad spectrum of socio-economic developmental issues as determined by the minister. It will be determined by the minister because we must also take into account that this fund, when it was established in 1978, there was no scenario of provincial government, local government, and national government. The nature of the state at the time did not have a picture of MECs and the provincial governments and all that. So the power was strictly given to the minister. That's why it was also very difficult for us, Honorable Chair and Honorable Members, to come up with a consensus in terms of whether this is a Section 76 legislation or a Section 75 legislation, because the time at which it was developed in 1978, there was no picture of Section 76 of the Constitution. And the powers in the legislation itself, they all are the powers of the minister, not the powers of the MECs and powers of the mayors, as the situation may be today. But nevertheless, we had to accept it in that fashion as a Section 76 legislation. So basically, the aim is to rationalize the Fundraising Act by consolidating the three funds, in fact, the four funds that I spoke to. That is the Disaster Relief Fund, which is active, the Refugee Relief Fund, a Social Development Fund, and the State President's Fund, which are actually inactive and dormant. And these funds will now become one fund, the Disaster Relief and National Social Development Fund, so as to focus on proactive mitigation of disasters and promote social development communities. That is the intention. This will therefore contribute to the streamlining of administrative processes, which are lying all over at present and making it difficult to deal with, and also rationalize the administrative and secretariat costs to the Department of Social Development, because the more the board members, the more the costs, and then that is problematic. The newly established Disaster Relief Fund, the National Social Development Fund, should be empowered to raise funds from members of the public, from the private sector, from the international donors, to address short-term intervention and also impact on long-term developmental issues. The amendment, Honorable Chair, honorable members and members of the community, will align the Fundraising Act with the provisions of the Disaster Management Act and the PFMA and other related frameworks. As I indicated earlier during the presentation, Honorable Chair, honorable members, and members of the community, that this piece of legislation has been overtaken by various pieces of legislation post its promulgation. As I indicated, that in 1997 we had the NPO Act, which had an impact. In 1999, the PFMA. In 2002, the Disaster Management Act. In 2004, the Social Assistance Act, and also the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, which also had an impact in terms of how the issue of welfare services as contemplated in Schedule 4 have to be dealt with in terms of the concurrency of the functions in terms of the Constitution. So basically, this is why we have to amend this piece of legislation so as to be able to respond to such issues, Honorable Chair, and align this piece of legislation to today's South Africa, and align it with the pieces of legislation that we have currently. So, for an example, if we look at the current provisions as they stand, Section 12 provides for the Minister of Social Development, but the minister there is defined as a Minister of Social Welfare and Pensions, which title does not exist today. So we also, by it being obsolete, we need to align it with the current scenario. Section 17 provides for the number of board members, which is currently sitting at 15, which is costly for the state. And now the proposed amendment seeks to reduce that to 10. Section 18 provides for the board of the Disaster Relief Fund with due regard to the financial position of the fund and the requirements of each case to render to persons, organizations, and bodies who suffer from disaster. That alone, once you speak of the financial issues and the disbursement of funds and all that, you can't do that outside the scope of the Public Finance Management Act. So that provision needs to be aligned with the current financial prescripts that deal with such issues. With regard to Section 20, a board may, in order to achieve its objects, collect contributions and may control the collection of contributions by other persons, organizations, and bodies, and all that. Again, this particular scenario is a challenge because once you speak of collection of funds, collection of monies that will be utilized for the purposes of the public, then you cannot do that outside the context of the fiduciary duty that as a board member one must have as contemplated in the Public Finance Management Act. So it therefore seeks to align it with the provisions of the PFMA. With regard to Section 20, subsection 1, a board may, in order to enable it to achieve its objects, collect contributions and contributions, which is the same scenario as the what I've just alluded to. So a board may exercise such powers and shall perform such functions as may be conferred or imposed it upon by this Act, and may exercise such powers as may be necessary or expedient or incidental to the achievement of its objects. And the challenge with this particular provision is that it does not specifically give a power to a particular person, which becomes one of the challenges I was relating to with regard to the response to a disaster. Because this act is simply saying the functions must be dealt with as given by this act. But who is given this power? Who must act? Is it the HOD? Is it the mayor? Is it the DG? Is it the MEC? Is it a mayor? Is it a minister or deputy minister? That is not clear. As a result, it becomes difficult to utilize funds under those circumstances until a power is very clear in terms of the legislation that the Minister of Social Development must do ABC, the mayor of a municipality must do ABC, or the MEC of a particular province must do 1, 2, 3. So in the absence of that very specific language, it becomes difficult to utilize the provisions of this act. Hence, there is a need for amendment. And Section 25 relates to the administrative work, including the receipt and disbursement of money, which I've also spoken to in the earlier provisions. That once you speak of the disbursement, receipt and disbursement of money, then we need to look at the functions of a board members of a board as contemplated in the PFMA, and also issues of the fiduciary duty that one must have at the end of the day, because you cannot receive and disperse money as in how one wishes without it being aligned with the pieces of legislation that we currently have that speak to how monies of the state have to be handled. With regard to Section 36, the minister has got a power to make regulations to form any application, authority, temporary authority, special authority permission, special permission, and all those other instruments and any other form required in carrying out the provisions of this act. So the minister must be able to make regulations so that at the end of the day it is clear as to what needs to be regulated. But what is very key with regard to this particular slide and part is that the minister may also make regulations for any matter which is the minister deems necessary or expedient to prescribe in order to achieve the objects of this particular act, which becomes very much easy for the minister to deal with this issue of turnaround time when there is a need for a disaster, that this can only be done once this has happened or that has happened. So if there are regulations that can easily and quickly be dispersed with, so that powers can be given to people to be able to unleash money and release it to NGOs, NPOs, if there is a need to do so, in order to be able to work on the ground. So without that power being explicitly given to the minister, it becomes difficult for that to be utilized. So this is what this deals with. And again, now, Honorable Chair, honorable members, and members of the community, what is very important is to look at the clauses that we have come up with all these challenges that I have alluded to. So there are clauses that we have proposed which would require your attention in terms of your commentary as in participatory democracy. Clause 1 seeks to amend the definition of the minister to be in line with the current dispensation because that title is obsolete as we have. Clause 2 seeks to reduce the number of board members from 15 to 10 in order to deal with issues of efficiency, effectiveness, including cost effectiveness, and also ensuring that the issue of turnaround time is being achieved quickly. Again, with regard to Clause 3 seeks to amend Section 18 in order to make provision for the objects of the Disaster Relief Fund. Remember, we have said we are consolidating 4 funds in order to come up with one fund, which is the Disaster Relief and National Social Development Fund. So because of that, that fund must be given specific objects in terms of the Act. So this amendment will also address that. Correctly so, because you must understand that each of these funds had a specific purpose. The State President's Fund had a purpose that is different from the Refugee Relief Fund. And because they all had different purposes, now we need to consolidate them to become one fund and have a common purpose rather than to have a multiple kind of purpose as it's currently the situation. Clause 4.6 to amend Section 20 to amend the Principal Act in order to empower the minister to give directions. This is one of the areas where we said this act does not necessarily give the power to anyone. It just says any power given in terms of this act, not necessarily saying by who exactly, who must call the shots, who must be able to give instructions. So this is what clause 4.6 to address. Clause 5.6 to amend Section 22 of the Principal Act in order to provide for the financial management and control of the funds to be in line with the PFMA, as we have indicated that these are outside the scope of the Public Finance Management Act. So this is why this clause needs to be amended. Clause 6 also needs to substitute Section 25 of the Principal Act. The proposed substitution seeks to further provide for the administrative work of the boards and for the disbursement of funds as managed by the boards that will have been established in terms of this act. So because of that reason, there is a need to ensure that these funds are consolidated, put into one fund, and then the issue of how they get to be administered is also spelled out clearly. Again, Honorable Chair, Honorable Members and members of the community, Clause 7 of the bill seeks to insert Section 25 capital A for the purposes of consolidating the funds that I referred to. So it's a clause that says these funds are hereby consolidated and a new fund is being established in order to deal with all the monies that have been sitting in these funds that get to be dissolved. So clause 7.6 to insert Section 25 capital A, the Principal Act, in order to provide for the discontinuation and transfer of certain funds. What will happen to these funds, as I explained in the slide that speaks to the monies themselves. So the inserted Section 25 capital A provides that as from the effective date, which is the date of commencement of Section 7, the following funds under Section 16 shall cease existence. And then there is a mentioning of the Refugee Relief Fund, State President's Fund, Social Relief Fund, and also the Disaster Relief Fund, which at the end of the day will then become the Disaster Relief and National Social Development Fund. So this part seeks to do that. That is the amendment of Section 25 by the insertion of Section 25 capital A. But now the question will then arise and say, what will then happen to the monies that are there, as I indicated, is where now this particular slide speaks about all monies credited into any fund that is being dissolved shall now vest in the new fund, that is the National, the Disaster Relief and National Social Development Fund. And any board that was established before now will be dissolved so that we come up with a new board in terms of this fund. And issues of assets and liabilities that had, the rights that had accrued or existed in terms of these funds that are being dissolved now will devolve upon the Department of Social Development, meaning that they will be going into this new Disaster Relief and National Social Development Fund. Again, with regard to Clause 8, which seeks to amend Section 36, is where now I was indicating that the minister will be given a power to make regulations. And in terms of the regulations, as one of the best or key regulation is that one that gives the minister a power to immediately make regulations so that when there is a disaster, it is easy for the money to be unlocked and be utilized for the purposes of the disaster. The question might be, but why can't that be done now in terms of this and it be part of the act? It becomes difficult because the disasters differ in shapes and sizes. Yeah, it becomes difficult to say today, this is how we'll respond tomorrow. Let the disaster visit us, and then we assess the nature of the disaster, and we know what kind of regulation will be required under those circumstances, because nobody knew about COVID-19, so it would not have been wise to have regulations in 2015 about COVID-19 that was to come in 4 years' time. You know, there are such things. Nobody knew about the floods that would visit KZN to that magnitude. So it would not have been easier to have regulations before. So it's best to have the disaster assess and make regulations quickly and unlock the funds. So that is basically the scenario that we have. So basically, Honorable Chair, honorable members of the community, honorable members of the House, this is what the bill provides for. And if one was to ask in a nutshell, Honorable Chair, what this bill is all about, what this legislation is all about, it's about the consolidation of the existing funds which are dormant into one fund, so that at the end of the day, that becomes the National Disaster Relief Fund for Social Development that will be utilized during the disaster. The second purpose is to ensure that the 1978 piece of legislation is aligned with the current pieces of legislation, so that at the end of the day, it is in sync in terms of the language and the purpose for this particular legislation, because as it is at cross purposes with regard to what these new pieces of legislation that have been developed during our dispensation are actually saying. So basically, that is the purpose, Honorable Chair, honorable members and members of the community, and we therefore recommend that stakeholders take note of the proposed amendments and provide comments. I thank you, Honorable Chair.
Yeah, that was a mouthful, eh? You may take another sip of water.
The whole bottle, not just a sip.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
I'm not going to give a lengthy input. I think the message is self-explanatory. I think it's clear. The dissolution of dormant funds, consolidation of the funds into one fund, the rationalization of the current Fundraising Act of 1978. I think that is also clear. And then the current Fundraising Act had become dysfunctional. I think that is key messages. And then one can give other input also, such as the funds will become one fund. The aim is to remove duplication. The aim is to streamline responses to disasters, and the fund will deal with a broad spectrum of socio-economical issues and other disaster management issues as well. And so one can go on and on. Honourable members, in saying that, the floor is open for any of you that want to make your comments and also your input. There's two hands already, Honourable Frey and Honourable Kassim, and Honourable Deirdre, and then Honourable Windvogel in that sequence. Honourable Frey, you may start.
Thank you, Chair. We've had this presentation already on the 17th of May, so I'm not going to labour the point. I just have to ask one question that came up. Why not repeal the bill completely and start from scratch? Thank you.
Okay, Honourable Kassim. Your mic, please.
Yeah, I've asked, thank you for the presentation as well. I've asked a few questions in the previous meeting as well. I do agree that this presentation was given in the previous meeting as well. like I said, I've asked this question previously as to why it has taken this long for the bill to be amended, and the responses today, once again, is not that convincing. I'd like to ask, how much are, or rather has board members been getting paid while the funds has been dormant to those in need? And do you think that is it not a crime that against humanity, rather, that these funds has been dormant all these years, knowing the crisis that we're going through and knowing how gender-based violence has increased, this getting back to the same question, while board members has been paid, and how has funds or payments to board members not been dormant? And then with these funds being dormant for a very long time, how much funds or how much money has been accumulated during this time? If you can just give an indication on that. And do you think that in your opinion, rather, has this national government or your department been negligent in the delaying of the releasing of these funds? And then to add, we know the history of the fundraising amendment bill, like you've mentioned, and it's general knowledge that this amendment bill was established in 1978 with a purpose to provide social relief to the white poverty at the time, as well as funding towards acts of terrorism and violence, among others. During that time, several white organizations benefited from that funds. Can you give me an indication how many of those organizations who benefited during that time are still on your system today? And then, as we know, in our colored and our African and our Indian communities, a lot of our community organizations are still struggling to get onto that system, to get funding for organizations and programs in the communities. How many Black, if I speak about Black, African, colored and Indian organizations are now benefiting from that funds, or have been benefiting from funds? And then, as we know, okay, I'll keep it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Honourable Deirdre, please.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, as you know, I'm an alternate, so if the questions have been asked before, I apologize. Just a few technical matters on the bill. In section 3, subsection, or technically clause 3, dealing with section 18 of the original bill, under A, Roman numeral 2, it speaks there to identify and prescribe social development activities or empowerment projects, and to provide, and that's obviously a new insertion, and it says in cash or otherwise. Now, my assumption is that because it's an insertion in the amendment bill, that the original one didn't allow for cash in the relief fund. So I just wanted to find out how the relief fund or the board will account for the disbursement of cash then, given that this is an assertion there. And then at clause 4, dealing with section 20 of the bill, I just want to check, because it's a consolidation of the disaster relief money. For example, COVID was also a disaster, but the COVID money went to the COVID relief fund. So I just wanted to find out, how does that work? Where does the COVID relief money go? Does that also deal with this particular disaster relief money? I just need a little bit of clarity in terms of the difference then. And then on clause 5, dealing with section 22 of the original bill, under subsection 6, it says there the financial year of the fund shall terminate on 31 March in each year or as prescribed by the minister. Now, I know, for example, in terms of the establishment of NPOs, NGOs, businesses, and so on, obviously the tax year is often used as the financial year end. So I just need a little bit of clarity as to what the purpose would be for the minister to prescribe a different financial year end in this regard. And then in clause 7, that deals with section 25A of the original act, in subsection E, it reads there that all abilities, assets and rights must devolve upon the Department of Social Development. But earlier in the clause in subsection B, it speaks to the Disaster Relief Fund continuing as the Disaster Relief and National Social Development Fund. So I just need a bit of clarity as to what is the difference in terms of those assets and liabilities devolving on the department and not on the the fund as a juristic entity in and of itself. And then just Amendment 8, I know the explanation in the memo and in the presentation speaks to the allowing of regulations by the ministers, but that's not actually what the clause say. The clause speaks to the insertion of the financial year in the fund as contemplated in section 22(6). So I just need a bit of clarity. Is the clause, no, it's not a clause because this is a bill, is the section in the original act already making provision for those regulations? Because this clause in this bill only makes provision for the financial year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Honourable Member. Honourable Vogel, please.
Thank you, Chairperson. Chairperson, mine is more a point of clarity. But allow me first to welcome the presentation done by Advocate. I just wanted to check with Advocate in terms of the South African National Defence Force Fund. I need clarity there. Are you saying that you are transferring that fund to the Defence Force, or is it also going to be part of the disaster fund? So I just need clarity there. Thank you, Chair. I also think this process is long overdue, but we welcome at least there is a move. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you so much. Honourable Advocate, you may answer. Yeah.
Thank you, honourable members, for the questions. The issue of the repeal. One of the ways of amending legislation is by a repeal. So it's the choice of the department in consultation with the state law advisors as to what would work best. Because you can amend the legislation by a repeal, by an insertion, by an addition, by a deletion, or all such other methods. So in this particular scenario, we chose an amendment of the particular existing provisions as opposed to a repeal, because the repeal would mean that these funds, they move off the road altogether. And then what would we then do with the monies after repealing this legislation? Because we still need to utilize these monies that are lying dormant in these funds. Hence, the idea of a repeal was not supported because of the need to still go ahead with this money, still keep the function of responding to a disaster to the Department of Social Development as contemplated in the disaster management framework as per COCTA. Because in terms of the disaster management framework, each and every department must have a role to play during a disaster. So it would take away that role if we would go for a repeal. With regard as to why has it taken this long, I know this question has been asked very many times indeed, but to be honest with you, this is an opportunity that was lost by those who existed before us. We had the first administration, the second administration, third administration, now we are in the sixth administration going for the seventh administration. When the PFMA, that is the Public Finance Management Act, was thought of in the early 90s, those who were developing the PFMA should have taken into account that there are funds lying in this 1978 legislation and do the exercise that we are doing today then. That is what was expected to have happened. So indeed, it has taken very long. It was a missed opportunity. And again, when the Disaster Management Act was developed and thought of, as a 2002 piece of legislation. Those who were dealing with the development of the Disaster Management Framework, Disaster Management Act, should have also taken into account that there are other disaster relief funds that are in terms of a 1978 piece of legislation. So we must also appreciate that at least at the end of the day, we have taken that into our hands during the 6th administration to deal with this. So we do acknowledge, but I don't think we are the right audience to respond well in terms as to why has it taken so long. What we can respond to in terms of taking so long is when we started this process as a department now, and say, yes, it may have taken even so long, even during our time, because the Portfolio Committee on Social Development finalized this about August, September last year. But it has also taken so long to move from the Portfolio Committee to the Select Committee. We are facing another September tomorrow. So it's just a year between the Portfolio Committee and the Select Committee alone. That's another lengthy period. Maybe we need to work on and see how things can be managed in that process. So legislation has proven to take very long in terms of the processes that need to be followed that are actually beyond our control as drafters, because we're only speaking from the drafting point of view, not the processing point of view. And the processing is actually dealt with mainly by Parliament. And not that we are trying to shift the blame to Parliament. That is not what we are saying, but we are just highlighting the process that needs to be followed when making legislation. There are so many role players. Sometimes we even feel that there is too much duplication in terms of how we do things. It's a legislative process of South Africa in terms of the rules of Parliament. I think that's where the issue might be. Like it has indeed taken so long. With regard to funds that have been dormant all along, yes, that has the impact in terms of what I've just alluded to. But we must also understand that the reason why these other funds have been dormant is not because there was no need for that money, but because the name, the tag in which they were made, or the tag that they were given, has not been consistent with the issues that we are dealing with today. For an example, we had the State President's Fund, and the State President's Fund, as I presented, was meant for issues of acts of terrorism in the country, where the president had to intervene in his capacity as a president if that happens. And I indicated during the presentation that we don't have such acts of terrorism in the country that we live in today. So it would have been impossible for the president to give effect to that fund if there is no act of terrorism. So that's why the money has been lying dormant. It's because of that reason. There is no need to use it. Now we are saying, because there are no acts of terrorism in South Africa, why not take that money and put it in the disaster relief fund? Because disasters are everyday thing. That is exactly what we are doing by this amendment. The refugee relief fund. The refugee relief fund, as I indicated, was not meant for the refugees that we are having currently in South Africa today. It was meant for refugees who would come outside the country and be part of the apartheid government and were working with the system of apartheid inside the country at the time. They were assisting the apartheid government to achieve its purpose. But that fund cannot be used today because apartheid is no more. But that fund was not deleted or repealed immediately after 1994, because it should have been repealed in 1994 when the new dispensation came in. So that is why this fund has been lying there all along. You see, that is the reason, and we cannot use it. And we are saying, because that does not make sense anymore in the world we live in today, we need to get that money back into the disaster relief fund today. So that is one of the reasons. How much accumulated? Well, I do not think I'm fit to speak to that because that is the matter of the CFO and the Treasury in terms of the monies for the state, in terms of the balances, how much interest they are accumulating in all that. But what we have been guaranteed by the Treasury that yes, there is money and it's accumulating interest. It is there because those funds are still active. I cannot give you figures as to how much interest since when. Safe to say, yes, the money is accumulating interest and the principal amount is actually 110 million rands, as I indicated in this.
Am I right? I might be stupid in saying active but dormant.
Yes, active but dormant. You are right, Chairperson. They are active in the sense that the bank account is there, it has got money, but the money is not being transacted on daily basis. Yes, you are right, Honorable Chair. Which organizations have benefited from this? Remember, for those that are dormant, they benefited the organizations that existed for that purpose at the time. It may not be it may not be an easy exercise today to say which organization was supporting apartheid and was receiving money from the Refugee Relief Fund. It would be difficult to answer that question in today's South Africa. How many organizations are benefiting from apartheid government and how many are still benefiting in the new dispensation and all that. But all what we are saying is that organizations that are involved in issues of disaster are benefiting from the disaster relief fund that we have in social development, as per the criteria that those who are responsible for paying out monies are using. They are still organizations. But as to whether they were even receiving some benefit during the apartheid era is something else. And it speaks also to the issue of the colors that you put on there in terms of the black organizations, the Indian organizations, and all that were the white organizations that were receiving at the time that are still receiving today. That information is not available. When we say the board may pay cash or otherwise, remember, as I indicated, that the disasters, they take different shapes and sizes. You don't know what mode of benefit you would utilize when a disaster comes. An example of that, a living example, is the COVID. COVID came as a disaster, and so much of disaster relief was embarked on, and part of that disaster relief culminated in a cash situation, the 350 that is being paid today, because it was because of the COVID issue. That is cash, and it is accountable for, because Treasury sits down and budgets and all that, numbers are worked out, Parliament appropriates the money for that reason. It is the same scenario that we are painting here, that in an event where there is a need to utilize cash, then cash will be used at the time, depending on the nature of the disaster. And it is prefaced with the word may. They may use cash or in kind, because sometimes they use food parcels, sometimes they use school uniforms, sometimes they use cash. You know, it depends on the nature of disaster that may have befallen the country at the time, or a part of the country which would speak to that. The example is what I've just given around the issue of COVID-19. And you must remember, as I said, it's not that this money has not, these monies, most especially the disaster relief fund, has not been utilized. I said that the disaster relief fund that is sitting at about 90 million has been used all along. It has been used for disaster by social development, because the Department of Social Development has a mandate in terms of the Disaster Management Act read within the National Disaster Management Framework, that as a department, it has an obligation to play a role during a disaster. So it has been playing its role, utilizing that funding. You will also take into account that I indicated that this disaster or fundraising act that speaks to a disaster in terms of social development. This fundraising act is a 1978 piece of legislation, and it's subsidiary when it comes to issues of disasters. It is an add-on to an overarching piece of legislation, which is the Disaster Management Act. COGTA is the one that is tasked with that function, the Disaster Management Act, but each department has got something to contribute. Social development, by its very nature of business, will have a role to play, which will be different from another department, which will be different from the role that is played by another department, which does not have a piece of legislation like this, but which has to subscribe to the disaster management framework as contemplated in the Disaster Management Act. With regards to the 31st March and the financial year and all that, remember, again, this is a question of this is a question of a discretion that may be utilized depending on the circumstances that may befall on the country at the time. Because if the financial year end currently is the financial year end as per Treasury, which is 31 March, but there may be a need to have something like COVID that we had. But in September, a declaration of the end of the disaster COVID comes into an end. What then happens to the monies that were hanging during that period? So a new financial period may be suggested to say everyone who was working on this and that project will have their financial year ending, say, 30th September, because that part of disaster is now no more. So this is just a precautionary kind of a situation to say, in an event where a disaster, because we don't know when the disaster will come and how long will it take, and what if it takes about 3 months and then at the end of June, for example, it comes to an end. Must we wait for the 31st March of the following year to be the end of the financial year for the monies that were dispersed to deal with such, or must we come up with a new financial year? So must the financial year be consistent with Treasury or with the financial year for SARS, or the financial year that will be determined by the minister when that time comes? This is the scenario we're trying to paint in that provision, as we have seen not so long ago when the minister of COGTA had to sit down and say, with effect from this particular date, there will be no more COVID regulations, and therefore anything that has got to do with that shall cease to exist. Meaning that you need to sit down now and say, but what about the monies that were being used by those who were tasked with dealing with the issue? So that's where the 31 comes in, and the issue of May comes in. May as in the discretion that may be used. The disaster relief fund, we said there are 4 funds that we have here. One of these funds is the disaster relief fund. The disaster relief fund is actually in existence, it's not dormant. And it is having an amount of money that is a residue from the monies that has been dispersed in the past. It's being utilized by the Department of Social Development in terms of the disaster management framework as contemplated in the Disaster Management Act. And because of that, that fund will, along with other funds that are dormant, be consolidated into one fund and there will be no disaster relief fund anymore. The disaster relief fund will assume a new name, which is the Disaster Relief and National Social Development Fund. That will be a new thing. So all the monies that will that are there in that fund and in the domain funds will now come into the new fund, which will be the National Disaster Relief Fund for Social Development, and also making it easy for the Department of Social Development to utilize even those funds that are dormant. So that is what is going to happen. With regards to the issue of South African National Defence Force, that fund is the fifth fund in terms of that act. So that fund is not going to be tampered with altogether. That fund is the fund of the Defence Force Department, the Department of National Defence Force. That fund is not dormant, it's active. They are utilizing that fund. When you see the National Defence Force being involved in Mozambique, rescuing people when there are floods and such disasters, they are utilizing that money. So they are busy. It's not even the amount that with you. Their balance, I did not even speak about it. It's outside the Department of Social Development, but it is in terms of that piece of legislation, the Fundraising Act, because they were expected in terms of the laws that existed at the time to also raise funds for disaster relief purposes. But the National Defence Force Act was not the right instrument to deal with that kind of a situation. I think I've responded to the questions, Honorable Chair.
May I ask, maybe there's a...
Oh, okay, I think there's an add-on.
No
okay.
problem.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Chair. To the questions. On the last question that was responded to with regards to this SANDF fund, what I was going to say that there's also the reason why we are not repealing this act, because if we repeat it, then it means we're going to do away with that fund, which is not within our purview. Thanks.
I'm just worried, looking at the magnitude of operations and the work that needs to be done, the amount of money is not that much. It's a tiny amount of money looking at what needs to be done. Let me ask the honourable members if your questions are saturated. Any other input, a follow-up input, Honourable Kasim, please?
Yes, thank you. Chairperson, you know we're going to public hearings for the next 3 days. I don't think that the public would want responses like we don't have that information at hand. You know, we have from now up until later in the next 3 days to get those responses. The same like the response to how much money was accumulated over these years. These are questions that the public are going to ask. They're going to want to know how many of those organizations who benefit during apartheid, which I also don't think you answered my question correctly. I asked you, how many of those organizations who benefit during apartheid are still on the system? Has some been removed? Or are all of them still on the system? And how many are white organizations and how many are black organizations? These are questions that the public are going to want to hear. And I don't think they're going to take it very easily when you say, I don't have that response at hand. I'm going to need to speak to the CEO. So are you able to get that responses now before getting to the public hearing tomorrow and tonight as well, if possible, please? Thank you.
You may.
Yes, definitely. I will. He is around. I will speak to him. He's busy with budget here. Up Play Street. I will be able to get that information.
Okay.
Thank you.
Put it from their side. You may.
Through the chair, the member over there had a very interesting question which I answered, and that was what happened to the remuneration for all the board members who sat on the boards of those dormant funds all the while, and if so, obviously that was a waste of money.
Can I get your name again and your organization?
Okay, I'm Irene Saunders and I'm from St. Luke's Combined Hospices.
You may answer.
Okay, thanks, Chair. I think I missed that. Remember, one of these funds was never dormant. It has been utilized throughout. But the manner in which the appointment of board members was done at the time was done with the understanding that the there are more funds that are in existence. So there were no board members actually sitting on the domain funds because it would not make sense in any language. There were no board members sitting there, but there were board members that are sitting in the disaster relief fund because it is active. And the number of those members, board members, in terms of the legislation that is we are repealing, we are amending, is saying number 15. And because of the number 15 in mind, they had the application of the other funds that are not in existence. So that is the situation. So the number of board members that are sitting are in the disaster relief fund, and they are compensated accordingly in accordance with the national treasurer. It's not by social development. All the board members are compensated in terms of national treasurer, in terms of their instruction note. And those board members will cease to exist as per this as per this amendment once it comes into law. I'll follow up on the number of organizations as well that were benefiting during apartheid and still benefiting today. Okay. But basically, it would be mainly white organizations that were benefiting during apartheid. I mean, as it would be obvious who would still be benefiting if there are any during the current dispensation.
Mr. Sanders, are you?
But I'll be able to.
You saturated. Okay, thank you so much. Okay. Any other member of the public with a question, with a remark, with an input? You are most welcome, even if you think it is not important and that sort of thing. Your non-important input might become the biggest important one after all. Sir, your name and organization, and then your question.
Thank you, Chair Daniel Minnar from Agri Western Cape. Thank you, Honourable Advocate, for the presentation. I think it was clear. We are in agreement that the amendments are long overdue. Just maybe for interest's sake, you are travelling tomorrow, I think, to Laingsburg.
That's right.
Laingsburg's economy, 35% of the economy is from the agricultural sector. I think that's significant. Laingsburg's also very prone to droughts and other disasters such as the locust plagues.
But also flooding.
And also floods. And the point I'm trying to make is when a disaster happens in a rural community such as Laingsburg, just for example, it's not only the farmers or the agricultural sector that gets affected, it is the whole community. The farmer is not able to employ the community, is not able to go and shop at the local store to fill up his tank at the local petrol station. So I think it's just important to keep that in mind. I've only one question, that's in terms of clause 2 that deals with section 17 of the Act, or the amendment, that states that the maximum number of board members will reduce from 15 to 10. How will the board be appointed? What's the process to appoint the board members? Will they be representative? Will there be an agricultural representative on this board? Because I think the sector is really prone to disasters, and the linkages and multiplier effects that has on the rest of the economy, I think, is profound. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. You may answer.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for the question. The appointment of the board members in South Africa is a predetermined kind of a process. Social development will not be deviating from that predetermined process and come up with a new process, because the process for the appointment of board members, as contemplated in the legislation and also the cabinet guidelines, is through the nomination or that gets to happen, And once that nomination happens, then there is a gazetting calling for such nominations, and that process gets to be followed in that way. And usually what is being recommended in those guidelines is that the appointment must be a representative of all the groups of that we have in South Africa, and also take into account the dynamics that we have. That is the people being affected, the people with disabilities, the people historically disadvantaged, and all that. So basically, that is the process that is normally followed. So if there are challenges like those, there are people who get to be affected and they are not taken into account, it would mean that, there is a challenge in that regard. Because the principle is very clear: nothing about us without us. That is the principle that gets to be applied under these circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you. You're okay with the answer? Follow up?
Yes, Chair. So will there be a gazette going out that will appoint new board members?
Yes.
Okay.
There will be a publication. It may not necessarily be the Gazette, but in the public newspaper, to say the Minister of Social Development would like to appoint board members for the National Disaster Relief Fund of Social Development, and nominations are called upon from interested persons to nominate people and submit names in a particular process. That's how it will happen.
That's normally the normal process.
That's normally the normal process. It will definitely go out.
Yeah. May I ask, I don't want to rush anything from the members of the public. You okay with your input, with your questions, with your remarks? Then for ordinary honorable members, you still have the opportunity, if there's something in your mind you want to say, a remark you want to make, you are most welcome to do that. Honorable Baku, you seems like someone. Okay. Let me say at this point in time then, I think, thank you. We're all grateful. I think it was a good presentation, good questions asked, and we still have a long 2-3 days to go. Let me just say to the members of the public, the administration must help me, but I think you have till the 9th of June to give written submissions, if you so wish to do that. Use that opportunity. Many a times people don't want to say how they feel and what they want to say, and sometimes people don't know how to express themselves. And then you can express yourselves in writing. By writing, even if it is comments, that sort of thing, issues of clarity, the 9th of June, I think it is 1700 hours the afternoon. And the Secretariat just whisper in my ear, in your language of choice, doesn't matter. We have interpreters that will interpret and that will tell us. If it is isiXhosa, they will change whatever. All the services are available. Yeah, okay. They say, the Secretariat says to me, even now, whatever language you want to use, I don't know if it is whatever language, how we will assist with that, but it's okay. I think that is it. Then ask and say to the two gentlemen representing the National Council of Provinces, we appreciate your presence. Thank you so much. It's not the first time. It will definitely not be the last time. We will see each other for the next couple of days up to Wednesday in Mossel Bay and so on. We will tour together. And we see you this afternoon in beautiful Saldanha. And for members of the public, we will join you right now. Give us a couple of minutes, but you walk right down the passage. There's a cup of tea, there's a cup of coffee, and make use of it. It's not every day that you get something for mahala, that you get something for free. Make, please, let me say to you, it is your tax, your own funding. Please make use of it. Please. Thank you. You may go. We release you, and we see you now. The committee need to sit for another couple of minutes just to look at one or two issues.
Okay, thank you very much, Chairperson. Information.
13, you said.
Chairperson, are we also releasing the department? You want to keep them here?
Yeah, for them.
Okay.
Ja. Jy is te lief vir jou koffie nou. Ek moet vir jou sê ek het nou 'n koppie koffie nodig. Baie dankie. See you guys now. Look, there's no resolutions to be taken right now, so we don't need to waste any time and that sort of thing. Just to look at the program, what we're going to do next, I think that is important. We want to be in Saldanha in time. We want to enter our hotel room quickly and that sort of thing before we leave for the venue. We save sometimes, so I thank you. It's the beauty we had, as Honourable Fry have said, last week we had the opportunity to look at the bill and went through it already, so it saves a lot of precious time. But I want to conclude one thing, that leaving time today, that we know what time we need to be downstairs. What are you saying? Let me see quickly. Yes, we can leave at 1. Is 1 o'clock fine? Yes.
Will we be in time? Because it starts at 4, right? Yeah. So if we leave by 1 for the very latest, because we can only check in at the hotel at 2 anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
Okay.
if you are fine with that, 1 o'clock, we see each other downstairs. That's it. Let's go and have a cup of coffee.